It started as a quiet day at the naval base. The morning sun stretched golden rays across the vast expanse of concrete, casting long shadows that danced gently in the breeze. The air was crisp, filled with the salty tang of the nearby ocean and the occasional sharp call of a seagull soaring overhead. It was peaceful, a typical morning where routine reigned supreme. Commander Ethan Briggs stood at the edge of the training grounds, his gaze fixed on the line of recruits practicing drills under the watchful eyes of his junior officers. Commander Briggs was a man who didn't seek attention, yet his presence alone commanded respect. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent facing the harshest trials, he carried himself with a quiet confidence. His uniform was immaculate, every crease and badge a testament to his discipline and pride. He was known among his peers as a man of action, one who let results speak louder than words. Despite his rank and reputation, Briggs never flaunted his authority. He had no need to. His calm demeanor and sharp mind set him apart. He had a knack for reading people, for understanding what made them tick, and using that insight to guide his team to success. He believed in leading by example, and that belief earned him the unwavering loyalty of those under his command. On this particular morning, his focus was entirely on the upcoming mission. In just a few days, the naval base would host a high-profile exercise involving multiple units from across the country. Briggs had been working tirelessly to ensure everything ran smoothly. He walked along the edge of the training field, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as recruits marched in perfect synchrony. Their boots thudded against the ground in a steady rhythm, a sound that Briggs found oddly soothing. Just as he began to mentally review the day's schedule, the distant roar of engines broke through the calm. It started as a faint hum, barely noticeable over the clamor of the base. But within moments, the sound grew louder, more insistent. Briggs turned his head toward the main gate, his sharp eyes narrowing as the source of the noise came into view. A rowdy group of motorcycles approached, their engines growling like a pack of wild beasts. The riders, clad in leather jackets adorned with bright patches and metal studs, were an unwelcome sight on the outskirts of the naval base. The leader of the group rode at the front, his bike gleaming under the morning sun. He was tall and broad, with a smirk that radiated arrogance. His leather jacket was covered in patches, symbols of rebellion, defiance, and a disregard for authority. "Max," someone muttered from the gatehouse, recognizing the leader. Max was infamous in the nearby towns, known for causing trouble wherever he went. He and his gang thrived on chaos, reveling in the discomfort of those who crossed their path. The gang slowed as they approached the main gate, their laughter ringing out like a challenge. Max pulled his bike to a stop and leaned forward, resting one arm casually on the handlebars. He looked up at the towering gate of the naval base, a sneer playing on his lips. "What's the big deal about a naval base anyway?" Max's voice carried over the rumble of engines. His gang erupted into laughter, their jeers echoing off the concrete walls. The gate guards, two junior officers, exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't prepared for a situation like this. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand to signal the bikers to stop. "This is restricted property," he called out, his voice steady but firm. "You need to turn around and leave." Max tilted his head, his sneer widening into a grin. "Restricted, huh?" he drawled. "What are you gonna do if we don't? Call in the Navy." His gang roared with laughter again, the sound grating against the otherwise serene morning. Briggs watched the scene unfold from a distance, his expression unreadable. He had seen men like Max before, bullies who thrived on intimidation and chaos. Without a word, he began walking toward the gate, his steps measured and deliberate. The recruits nearby noticed his movement and paused, their attention shifting to the unfolding drama. As Briggs approached, the guards straightened, relief evident in their posture. One of them stepped aside to let him through. Max's smirk faltered slightly as he took in the tall, imposing figure now standing before him. Briggs said nothing at first, letting the weight of his presence settle over the group. The bikers, emboldened by their leader's bravado, shifted restlessly on their bikes, their laughter quieter now but still present. Max recovered quickly, his grin returning as he eyed Briggs. "And who might you be?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Briggs didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past Max, taking in the group of bikers and their defiant expressions. His sharp eyes caught the patches on their jackets' symbols that hinted at their lawless activities. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an unmistakable authority. "You're on restricted ground," Briggs said simply. "You have two options: leave now, or face the consequences." The laughter stopped. Max stared at Briggs, his grin frozen in place. For a moment, the only sound was the rumble of the idling engines. Then, Max chuckled, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Consequences," he repeated, his tone incredulous. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you might want to rethink your approach, old man." Briggs didn't react to the insult. He stood his ground, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no anger in his expression, no sign of intimidation. He was calm, controlled like a storm waiting to be unleashed. Max's gang exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected the guards to back down, maybe even beg them to leave. But this man? He wasn't flinching. For a brief moment, the tension hung heavy in the air, like the calm before a thunderstorm. And as the sun continued to rise, its rays glinting off the motorcycles and the gleaming badges on Briggs's uniform, it became clear to everyone watching, trouble had indeed ridden straight into the wrong man's world. The quiet tension at the gate was palpable, a stark contrast to the rowdy chaos the bikers brought with them. Commander Ethan Briggs stood tall and unyielding, his sharp gaze locked on Max. Though he didn't move a muscle, his presence alone was enough to silence even the most arrogant members of the gang. Yet, Max wasn't one to back down easily. The gang leader leaned back on his bike, arms crossed, and smirked. "I don't think you understand how this works, old man," Max said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're just passing through. Don't see the harm in us hanging around for a bit, do you?" Briggs remained silent for a moment, his gaze shifting briefly to the rest of the gang. There were 8 of them in total, each one projecting the same air of defiance as their leader. Their jackets were decorated with various symbols, skulls, flames, and patches that told stories of rebellion and chaos. The other bikers chuckled nervously, emboldened by Max's boldness but wary of the calm authority radiating from Briggs. One of them, a wiry man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, piped up. "Yeah, what's the harm? It's not like we're causing trouble." Briggs's eyes flicked back to Max, unamused. "This is a naval base," he said, his voice firm yet calm. "Not a highway. You don't belong here. Leave. Now." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that seemed to hang in the air. Max's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments before he covered it with a chuckle. "You've got guts," he said, revving his engine as if to emphasize his point. The roar of the bike echoed across the base, a sharp contrast to the disciplined silence of the naval officers nearby. "All right, Commander Tough Guy," Max said, his tone mocking. "What are you gonna do? Call in the Navy SEALs? Bring out the big guns for a few bikers." The gang laughed again, though the sound was less confident this time. Max was pushing boundaries, testing just how far he could go before the man in front of him snapped. But Briggs didn't snap. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots crunching softly against the asphalt. The laughter died down as the gang realized they might have underestimated the quiet man in uniform. Briggs's voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the tension like a blade. "You don't want to find out," he said simply. Max stared at him, his smirk fading entirely now. There was something unsettling about the way Briggs carried himself, calm, collected, and completely unbothered by their antics. For the first time, doubt crept into the gang leader's mind. Before Max could respond, the sound of more footsteps approached. A group of naval officers, led by Lieutenant Harper, had gathered behind Briggs. Harper, a young but highly competent officer, looked to Briggs for guidance. "Commander," he said, his tone respectful but urgent, "is everything all right here?" Briggs nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving Max. "Everything's under control, Lieutenant," he replied. Max glanced at the growing number of officers, his confidence waning further. But he wasn't ready to back down just yet. Turning to his gang, he gestured with a nod. "Looks like the Navy brought reinforcements," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Guess they really are scared of a few motorcycles." The gang laughed nervously, their bravado faltering as they noticed the stern expressions of the naval officers. The recruits who had been practicing drills earlier were now watching from a distance, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. One of the junior officers stepped forward, his hand resting on the radio clip to his belt. "Sir," he said, addressing Briggs, "should we call for additional security?" Briggs raised a hand, signaling the officer to stand down. "That won't be necessary," he said. The gang exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected resistance, but not this level of composure. Most people in their position would have been flustered, maybe even intimidated. But Briggs? He was as steady as a rock, completely unfazed by their presence. Max narrowed his eyes, trying to regain control of the situation. "All right, Commander," he said, his tone sharper now. "We'll leave. But next time, maybe you should think twice before stepping in our way." Briggs didn't respond. He simply watched as Max revved his engine and signaled for the gang to follow. One by one, the bikers turned their bikes around, their bravado deflating as they rode away. As the gang disappeared down the road, Lieutenant Harper stepped closer to Briggs. "That could have escalated quickly," he said, his voice low. Briggs nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not over," he said quietly. Harper frowned, glancing in the direction the bikers had gone. "You think they'll come back?" Briggs didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to face the recruits who had been watching from a distance. "Get back to your drills," he called out, his voice carrying across the field. The recruits snapped to attention and resumed their exercises, their movements more precise now, as if inspired by the calm authority of their commander. As the officers dispersed, Harper lingered for a moment, still troubled by the encounter. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "those bikers, they didn't seem like the type to just let this go." Briggs glanced at him, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Neither am I," he said. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting the base in a bright, almost harsh light. Briggs returned to his office, but his mind remained on the encounter at the gate. He had dealt with men like Max before, men who thrived on intimidation and chaos, who mistook calmness for weakness. But Briggs knew better. He knew that true strength didn't come from loud words or flashy displays. It came from discipline, from knowing when to act and when to hold back. And if Max and his gang thought they could challenge that strength, they were in for a rude awakening. The bikers weren't supposed to be there. A naval base isn't a playground, and its boundaries weren't open for debate. But none of that mattered to Max and his gang. They weren't the kind of people who cared for rules, let alone rules set by someone in uniform. For them, authority was a target, not something to respect. Max, at the head of his rowdy group, sat confidently on his gleaming black motorcycle, a predator surveying his surroundings. The rest of his gang mirrored his defiance, revving their engines like growling beasts. The sound echoed across the base, disrupting the quiet discipline that had ruled the morning. Nearby, junior officers at the gate were trying to contain the situation, though their unease was obvious. One of them, a younger recruit fresh out of training, stepped forward, his hand raised in an attempt to stop the escalating noise. "This is a restricted area," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous glance he shot toward his partner. "You need to leave immediately." The gang's laughter drowned out the officer's words. Max leaned back on his bike, feigning boredom as he raised an eyebrow. "Restricted, huh?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What's next? Gonna call in your little Navy boats to chase us off?" The gang erupted in laughter, their jeers echoing off the concrete walls of the gatehouse. The younger officer clenched his jaw, his frustration evident, but he held his ground. The other officer stepped forward cautiously, pulling out his radio, but his hands trembled slightly. Meanwhile, Commander Ethan Briggs watched from a distance. He was standing near the training grounds, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the scene with a calculated calmness. His recruits were still performing their drills, though their movements were less focused now, their attention drawn to the commotion at the gate. Briggs didn't move immediately. He wasn't one to rush into things, preferring to assess the situation first. His sharp eyes took in every detail: the way Max dominated the group, the nervous glances exchanged between the bikers, and the officers' growing tension. Briggs had seen men like Max before. They were loud, brash, and overconfident, but it was often a mask for something weaker underneath. At the gate, Max was growing bolder. He revved his engine loudly, the deafening roar causing one of the junior officers to take an involuntary step back. "Kman," Max said, grinning. "It's just a road, isn't it? Don't tell me you Navy guys are scared of a few motorcycles." One of the bikers, a lanky man with a tattered jacket, chimed in. "Maybe we should stick around and teach 'em what real power looks like." The gang whooped and cheered, their taunts carrying through the air. The tension at the gate was thick, and for a moment, it seemed like the officers might call for backup. Then, without warning, Briggs began walking toward the scene. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, yet they carried a weight that seemed to draw everyone's attention. The recruits on the training field noticed first, their drills faltering as they watched their commander approach. Then the officers at the gate turned, relief flashing in their eyes as they recognized him. Even the bikers, with all their bravado, couldn't ignore the quiet authority that radiated from the man in uniform. Max squinted as Briggs drew closer, his grin fading slightly. There was something about this man, something unsettling. Unlike the younger officers who had tried to stand up to him, Briggs didn't look nervous or unsure. He looked steady, grounded, and completely unbothered by the gang's presence. Briggs stopped a few paces away, his hands still clasped behind his back. He surveyed the group of bikers for a moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and calm, yet it carried a weight that silenced the gang's laughter. "You've been told to leave," he said simply. Max tilted his head, his grin returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone mocking. "The parking lot attendant." The gang snickered, but the sound was more subdued now, as if they weren't entirely sure they wanted to provoke this man. Briggs didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he shifted his gaze to the officers standing nearby. "Get back to your posts," he said quietly. The officers hesitated for a moment, then nodded and stepped away, their relief evident. Max's grin widened as he misread the gesture. "What's this?" he said. "Calling off your backup already? I'm almost disappointed." Briggs turned his attention back to Max, his expression calm but unyielding. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "This is a naval base. You don't belong here." Max's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly covered it with a laugh. "You really think you can just tell us what to do?" he said, gesturing to his gang. "We go where we want, when we want." "Got it, Commander." He spat the title with mockery, leaning forward on his bike as if to challenge Briggs further. The bikers revved their engines again, trying to amplify the tension. But Briggs didn't react. He stood his ground, his steady gaze fixed on Max. There was no anger in his expression, no sign of intimidation, just an unwavering resolve that seemed to unsettle even the cockiest members of the gang. One of the bikers, a burly man with a shaved head, shifted uneasily in his seat. Max," he muttered, his voice low enough that only his leader could hear. "Maybe we should just go. This guy, he's not like the others." Max shot him a sharp look, silencing him. But the doubt had already begun to spread. The gang's confidence, so loud and overpowering moments ago, was starting to waver. Briggs took a step closer, his boots clicking softly against the asphalt. The sound was small, but it carried a gravity that seemed to ripple through the group. He spoke again, his voice calm yet commanding. "You've had your fun," he said. "Now it's time to leave. Or I'll make sure you regret staying." The bikers froze, their engines idling as the weight of Briggs's words sank in. Even Max couldn't hide his hesitation now. There was something about the man standing in front of him, something that made him second-guess his usual tactics. But Max wasn't ready to back down completely. Not yet. He straightened on his bike, trying to regain his composure. "Fine," he said, his tone dismissive. "We're leaving. But don't think this is over, Commander." He revved his engine one last time before signaling to his gang. One by one, the bikers turned their bikes around, their earlier bravado deflating as they rode away. Briggs watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't relax until the sound of their engines faded into the distance. Then, he turned to the officers standing nearby. "Double the patrols around the perimeter," he said. "I want every inch of this base monitored." "Yes, sir," the officers replied, their voices steady despite the tension still lingering in the air. As Briggs walked back toward the training field, the recruits resumed their drills with renewed focus. They had witnessed their commander handle a volatile situation with nothing more than calm authority, and it left an impression. But in the back of Briggs's mind, one thought lingered. This wasn't over. Max and his gang weren't the type to let things go. And when they came back, and Briggs was certain they'd be in for a reckoning. The sound of the bikes had barely faded when Lieutenant Harper approached Commander Briggs, his face etched with concern. "Sir," Harper began cautiously, "those guys aren't just your average troublemakers. Did you see the patches on their jackets? That's a local gang, the Iron Fangs. They've got a reputation for stirring up trouble, and they don't back down easily." Briggs nodded, his expression calm but thoughtful. "I noticed," he said simply. "They were testing us, seeing how far they could push before we reacted." "And what happens when they come back?" Harper asked, glancing toward the gate as if expecting the gang to reappear at any moment. "They will come back," Briggs replied, his tone steady. "People like that don't take no for an answer. But they'll be walking into a situation they're not prepared for." Harper hesitated. "You really think they'll try to challenge the Navy on its own base?" Briggs turned to face Harper, his sharp gaze cutting through the younger man's doubt. "They see us as symbols of authority. That makes us a target. But what they don't understand is that authority isn't about power for the sake of power, it's about discipline, strategy, and knowing when to act." Harper nodded, though the weight of Briggs's words didn't ease his tension. "Understood, sir. I'll notify the patrol teams and ensure we're ready for anything." As Harper walked away, Briggs turned his attention back to the training field. The recruits were performing better now, their movements sharper and more deliberate. They had seen their commander handle the bikers with an unshakable calmness, and it had left an impression. But Briggs knew that calmness alone wouldn't be enough if the gang returned. The hours passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered. Around the base, officers were on high alert, their patrols doubling as they monitored every corner for signs of trouble. The once quiet naval base now buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation. Meanwhile, at a rundown bar just outside the city limits, Max and his gang were regrouping. The Iron Fangs had carved out a reputation as a fearless group of outlaws, but the encounter with Commander Briggs had rattled them. Max paced back and forth, his boots scuffing against the stained wooden floor. "I'm not letting that smug Navy guy get away with disrespecting us," he growled, slamming his fist against the bar. The cheap bottles of liquor rattled, but none of the bikers dared to react. The lanky biker, the same one who had voiced his unease earlier, spoke up hesitantly. "Max, maybe we should let it go. That guy, he wasn't like the others. You saw how he didn't even flinch." Max rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "Let it go? Are you serious? We've got a reputation to uphold. If we back down now, everyone will think we're weak." "But Max," another biker chimed in, "this is a naval base we're talking about. They're not just gonna sit back and let us mess with them." Max scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "I don't care if it's a naval base or the Pentagon. Nobody tells us where we can and can't go. And that commander? He thinks he's untouchable. I say we show him what happens when you mess with the Iron Fangs." The gang exchanged uneasy glances, but Max's fiery determination was contagious. One by one, they nodded, their initial doubts giving way to the pull of their leader's unrelenting confidence. Back at the base, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Commander Briggs stood by the edge of the training field, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The recruits had finished their drills and were now gathered in small groups, discussing the day's events in hushed tones. Lieutenant Harper approached, a clipboard in hand. "Sir, the perimeter teams report no unusual activity so far," he said. Briggs nodded. "Good. But tell them to stay vigilant. The Iron Fangs won't let this go easily." Harper hesitated, then added, "Sir, some of the younger officers, they're nervous. A few of them haven't dealt with anything like this before." Briggs turned to Harper, his expression firm but not unkind. "Nervousness is normal. It's what you do with it that matters. Remind them that we're not just defending a base, we're upholding everything this uniform stands for." Harper nodded, his resolve hardening. "Understood, sir." The bikers returned just after midnight. Their engines roared through the stillness, the sound slicing through the night like a blade. This time, they didn't stop at the gate. Instead, they rode straight toward the main entrance, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The base came alive instantly. Alarms blared, and officers sprang into action, moving with practiced efficiency. Floodlights illuminated the bikers as they advanced, their shadows stretching ominously across the pavement. Commander Briggs stepped out of his office, his calm demeanor unshaken by the chaos around him. He didn't rush. Instead, he walked with deliberate purpose toward the commotion, his presence alone commanding attention. At the front of the gang, Max pulled his bike to a screeching halt, the tires skidding against the asphalt. He removed his helmet and stared directly at Briggs, his smirk returning. "Didn't think we'd come back, did you, Commander?" Briggs stopped a few paces away, his hands once again clasped behind his back. "I expected you," he said simply. Max chuckled, his gang echoing his laughter. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far." Briggs tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "And arrogance only gets you in trouble." The air between them was electric, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Behind Briggs, a line of naval officers stood ready, their stances firm and their expressions resolute. Max revved his engine, the roar filling the silence. "We're not leaving this time," he said. "Not until you admit you're out of your league." Briggs didn't flinch. Instead, he took a single step forward, his voice steady and calm. "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Commander Briggs didn't need to raise his voice. His authority wasn't about volume or threats, it was something deeper, something innate. As he stood there, facing Max and the gang, the quiet strength in his posture was enough to make even the most brash among them hesitate. But hesitation didn't last long with Max in charge. Max leaned back on his bike, smirking as he surveyed the commander. "You've got guts, old man," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "But guts don't mean much out here." Briggs met Max's gaze evenly, his expression unreadable. "You're on restricted ground," he said, his voice calm but firm. Max chuckled, revving his engine loudly enough to send vibrations through the air. The rest of the gang followed suit, their motorcycles growling like a pack of wolves. "And what are you gonna do about it?" Max shot back, his grin widening.